Welcome to the Holy Post. On today's show, the battle between Governor DeSantis and Disney is heating up in Florida. The culture wars may be good for politicians, but why are they so bad for Christians? Then a former White House spokesperson says if Christians really want to win the culture, they need to have more babies. Kaitlyn and I explain why that strategy completely contradicts the New Testament. Then Phil looks at Grove City College's anti-CRT statement and why the school's attack on Jemar Tisby amounts to revisionist history. Then Kaitlyn sits down and talks to Rachel Anderson from the Center for Public Justice about her advocacy for paid family leave. If it's been proven to reduce abortions, why do so many Christians still oppose it? All of that, plus Phil is building a big, beautiful wall. Here is episode 506.
Hey there, welcome back to the show. This is Phil Vischer. Welcome back to the Holy Post podcast. I am here with Kaitlyn Shess. Hi, Kaitlyn.
Hi, Phil.
And Skye Jitani. Hi, Skye.
Hi, everyone.
If you're watching on YouTube, you'll notice that my background has changed and there's a whole bunch of pegboard behind me and some 2x4s. That is not finished. I'm building a wall. I'm building a background. And the reason is, here's the story. You want the backstory, Kaitlyn?
Are there immigrants trying to get into your office?
No, I have been running around all weekend saying, I'm going to build the wall. I'm going to build the wall. And then I did it yesterday. Yesterday. No, Kaitlyn, it's funny. It's a funny joke. It's just a funny joke. It doesn't have to hurt anyone's feelings. It's just a funny joke. So we bought this house, 6 years ago. And one of the reasons that we liked it is because it had an in-law apartment over the garage. I thought that's a perfect place for me to work. I'm going to work up there. And then our son moved back in from college and there's a bedroom in the in-law apartment. So he took that bedroom. So my son lives up here. And so every time he walks out of his bedroom, he's on camera. And he got tired of that because he felt like he was getting, he would hear me podcasting or live streaming, and then he would feel like he's trapped in his bedroom for the next hour and a half and can't come out. So it's partly to do that. It's partly to handle acoustics, and it's partly to create a more visually appealing background than the whole in-law apartment. So that's the deal. And, maybe I was inspired by Skye's wonderful new paint job that isn't black.
Well, we got to wait and see what you put on that pegboard of yours.
I know.
Yeah.
I know. Pegboard is just the start. It's the base. Then it's the cake. It's not the frosting. Then comes the frosting. It's going to be great. Okay.
I can't wait.
Here's no one can say I can't wait with less enthusiasm than Skye Jitani. Okay, here's the theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Kaitlyn. Kaitlyn, you're almost done. You're almost done with your first year.
Yeah.
Your whole first year. You survived your whole first year at Duke. Divinity. Are you still, first question, are you still a Christian?
I was just going to say, I have not lost my faith.
Okay, that's good.
I still am an Orthodox Christian. And honestly, I don't think many of my opinions about things have really changed, but I have read way more and have been exposed to way more ideas. And I've had just the best year. It's been so much fun.
Really?
That's a good endorsement.
Yeah.
That is a good endorsement. I'm going to go to Duke Divinity School right now. Where do I apply? Can you get me in? I know Kaitlyn Shess from the Holy Post podcast. Where do I apply?
If they would like to be a sponsor, you know who to send them to.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Sure.
That might be a little far for them, but
Probably.
I hear your advisor is a big fan of the podcast.
He hasn't listened yet. We'll see.
Okay.
Well, she's still a student there.
I am still a student. Yeah. Yeah.
Because if he had listened, he may have rescinded
Yeah.
invitation.
Yeah. I hear you. Okay. I have to go back to Florida. I don't know why I have to go back to Florida, but I have to go back to Florida. Although Skye, you just picked up you picked up a gaggle of women from the airport at midnight last night. This is how Skye rolls. He's got a big SUV, so he drives around airports looking for women who needs rides. And this one happened to include my 80-year-old mother.
Okay, you need to because that sounded like I'm into human trafficking or something.
That was pretty bad.
Well, I didn't say that.
Or I host bachelorette parties.
Yeah, that's kind of what it was. It kind of was a bachelorette party, but it was for my mother's 80th birthday. And she and some of her closest girlfriends went down to Florida to party for the weekend.
And this included my wife. It wasn't like I just volunteered myself.
Yeah.
To drive all these people.
You would have done it anyway, even if your wife wasn't part of it.
Of course.
Yeah, because that's the kind of guy you are. And what state was my mother and her friends in when you picked them up from the airport? Were they like leaning on each other and falling over?
No, they had a long trip because they had a layover in Nashville, I think, and it was it was late at night, but they were very happy and giddy and sharing about their fun weekend and stuff they did. And
okay,
yeah, everyone was chipper.
Okay, I wrote a song for my mother's 80th birthday.
I heard it. I saw the video.
I'm not gonna play for the public.
Oh,
yeah. It's a ukulele song, though.
It is a ukulele song for my mother's 80th birthday because that's how I roll. That's how I roll.
Sweet,
isn't it? Isn't it endearing?
Yes. I did like the ending. Or maybe was it the ending, or you referenced current events in Florida?
Oh, I may have.
Now you're just being mean to people, just teasing them about the song they can't hear.
We're not going to bring that up. Governor DeSantis has gone after Disney. We talked about this before, but it's escalating. It's escalating, and he used the nuclear option. And if you don't know what the nuclear option is, when you're dealing with Disney in Florida, it's revoking their special tax district, the Reedy Creek Improvement District. If you don't know what that is, if you've never heard the term Reedy Creek Improvement District, where have you been, first of all? That's like, if you're a Disney fan, that's like, Mickey Mouse, Reedy Creek Improvement District. When Walt Disney was building stuff in Anaheim, one of the things that annoyed him, two things annoyed him. One was that the neighbors, he had neighbors, and they could put up cheap motels around his park, and then, tourists would see all this cheap stuff. The other thing that annoyed him was anytime he wanted to do anything, he had to go through the city of Anaheim Planning Commission and zoning and approvals and permits and all of that. So when he got to Florida, he said, first of all, I'm going to buy 35,000 acres so I don't have any neighbors. I'm not going to have any neighbors. No neighbors to worry about. Second of all, he went to the state and said, if I'm going to do this project, I cannot be part of a municipality. I need to be the municipality. And the Florida legislature granted him that extraordinary request of letting a company be its own municipality, and that launched the Reedy Creek Improvement District. So that meant that the Disney company provides fire service, provides emergency medical service, could provide their own police force, their own policing, except that Walt didn't like the idea of speeders on vacation being pulled over by Disney cops and written tickets. So they officially declined to launch their own police force and instead let the county do all of that with sheriffs. So the county has to police Disney property, but the Disney company provides all the utilities, provides emergency medical care, provides fire. If you have a fire on Disney property, the fireman who shows up is a Walt Disney employee.
With very large shoes and a hose that plugs into some living fire hydrant.
That's right. That then sings a song while they put out the fire. Were you aware of that, Kaitlyn? Did you know that?
Which part?
The whole thing.
Oh, yeah. Know. You can't see it, but right over there on that bookshelf are like 3 different books of Disney history.
Oh, my gosh.
I'm obsessed.
My goodness. I had no idea. So this gives the Walt Disney Company an advantage in Florida that then when they want to build something, they don't have to deal with zoning. They don't have to deal with municipality approvals because they are the mayor. They are the mayor of Disney World, and they set whatever zoning they want. They still have to deal with building codes set by the county or the state or the federal level, but there are no local building codes or zoning ordinance they have to deal with because they are the local government. And that is what DeSantis went after. The ultimate nuclear option. We gave this to Walt 60 some years ago. Yeah, 60 some years ago. And we're going to take it away. Why? Because you're woke and you're trying to end democracy in Florida. That's kind of what he said.
Okay.
being anti-democratic.
No, this is the part that I find there's so many parts of this that are absolutely bonkers. But the Disney Corporation is the largest employer in the state of Florida.
Yeah.
They, without a question, when they came into Florida in the late 1960s and then established Disney World, made Florida into a global vacation destination.
Yeah.
Right?
It's now there's the number one tourist. Orlando's the number one tourist destination in the world.
Right.
Because
so there's no question that this company has done more for the state of Florida than anyone.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason DeSantis is going after this company is because as a company, it has been using its freedom of speech rights to vocally disagree with a policy of this governor.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's just
Boom.
insanely
nuclear option.
But
nuclear option.
Like, it isn't like Disney has done something illegal. It's not like they've done something unconstitutional. It's not like they've done something which is contradicting the policies of the state of Florida that make them an unwelcome neighbor anymore. They just voice disagreement with a bad law to begin with. Whether you agree with the intent of the law or not is separate, but the way it's written is just a bad law. And for that, the Republican, supposedly pro-business governor of Florida goes after the biggest business in Florida that the entire state's economy depends on. I mean, that's so stupid.
Yeah, it kind of firms up, because when I grew up, my family was Republican. Do you know why we were Republican? Because we were Christian? No, that wasn't why people were Republicans in the 70s. People were Republicans in the 70s and the 60s because they were management, not labor. My grandfather was a senior executive at a decent-sized company. He actually flew in a corporate jet around the country to meetings and conferences and all sorts of stuff. So he was kind of a bigwig, and he very much considered himself management, therefore Republican, because ever since about 1900, 1905, 1910, the Republican Party decided it was going to be the party of big business in America. And the Democratic Party was the Workers' Party, with the party of labor unions. So for the Republican Party to attack a huge American corporate success story and actually try to damage their business is pretty astonishing. One legislator, Florida legislator said out loud what you shouldn't say out loud. They said, we would give them back their special privileges if they support Republican candidates.
Again, bonkers. Okay, two other things about the story that are just so ridiculously not Republican.
Yes.
Along with being pro-business for the last century, the Republican Party, until very, very, very recently, has been anti-government regulation.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They want personal autonomy, get out of my, don't tread on me kind of attitude about government. And here you have Disney, a corporation that carved out a special space for itself where it's less regulated by the government. And it's been immensely successful as a result. And here comes the Republican Party in Florida saying, no, we want to control and regulate you, which flies in the face of everything. And then secondly, if this actually ends up happening, the Reedy Creek Improvement District, all those responsibilities, fire, utilities, all that kind of stuff, has to be taken over by two other Florida counties, Orange County and whatever it is. Yeah, which is going to put an enormous financial burden on the taxpayers of those counties. So you're going to probably increase the taxes of Florida citizens to pay for services within Disney World. Again, higher taxes is not traditionally the Republican point of view. Yeah. And DeSantis and the other Republicans in the state legislature are doing all of this because of a culture war spat.
Yeah, and the other irony is someone pointed out how upset conservative Christians were when San Antonio, Texas, said they wouldn't let Chick-fil-A build a restaurant in the airport because of their political statements about gay rights. And conservatives say, well, that's free speech. They should be able to say whatever they want, and they shouldn't be punished by a government simply because of their strongly held positions. And this is exactly what we're seeing happen in Florida, ironically. Kaitlyn, you've got something to say because you've got 3 Disney history books on your shelf.
Well, it is just so strikingly representative of why particularly Christians in power, or Christians who are gunning for power or approximate to power, have failed to do some of the things that they initially, in the last 100 years have said they wanted to do, which is to fight back against the sexual revolution, against access to contraceptives, and then later to abortion, to have these kind of like cultural issues of gender and sexuality and family be really important. We've failed not only because we tend to sacrifice those issues when it comes to other things like immigration and foreign policy, but also because we don't understand how those shifts change culturally if we think that we can kind of strong arm a company like Disney into doing something that we like, or that we can just win cultural points by punishing them. It's striking to me that there was I saw on Twitter at least, Christians who were interested in politics and wanting to change things politically, sort of praising this, or praising the idea of kind of pushing back politically against companies that put messages out like that, instead of saying, why have we lost the storytelling battle on gender and sexuality and family stuff? And why are we not putting more resources behind and being more thoughtful about telling stories in a way that's really persuasive to people? Because it hasn't been, the Supreme Court decision about gay marriage changed a lot of things, but what really changed conversations with everyday people and how they think about things was storytelling, and the way that changed communities and changed culture. And if we think that it also just shows how short term our thinking is, because there's no world where anyone involved in this thinks that pushing back against Disney is actually going to have some kind of cultural impact on the way that stories get told like that. What they're doing, like Skye said, is just owning the libs. And if we have such short term thinking about all of these things, where you might get a moment on social media where some hyper conservative people like that you did this, or like the language you use to talk about it, it's not going to get you the long-term gains that you want. And it just harms your ability to then later tell stories that are really persuasive, because you've been caught up, like Skye said, in this culture war mentality that's so toxic to everyone around it that you can't have a fruitful conversation about what it would look like to tell good stories about gender and sexuality that prioritize people's faithfulness and their flourishing, and find creative ways to do that. You can't even have that conversation anymore, because it's all caught up in some political stuff that isn't even just political, and that makes it bad, but it's really bad political work, and that kind of taints the whole project.
Are you suggesting that culture wars make it harder for us to live faithful Christian lives?
Weirdly enough, yes.
but they animate us. They inspire us. They give us energy.
Well,
everybody loves a good crusade, Kaitlyn.
Even just the language of culture war feeds into that short-term versus long-term mentality, right? If it is a war and I have violent language that's associated with it, then of course me really showing it to someone, even rhetorically on social media, suddenly feels like it's this significant thing to do, when the longer, slower, harder work of creating, whether it's creating good stories and telling good stories, or whether it's doing really slow, faithful political work that changes the conditions under which people can materially flourish, none of that kind of fits into the language of war, or has quite the same short-term, kind of emotional impact that some of the things that people are doing now have.
Yeah, I'm not even sure it's fair to call this or the particular events in Florida as culture war, because when you look at the details of the story, it's highly unlikely that this is even going to happen. Mm-hmm. The legislature passed this bill and the governor signed it. Doesn't go into effect for over a year, I think. The courts are going to stop it. And in the details, there's really no mechanism by which it actually occurs. And nobody wants it to occur, because it's going to hurt Disney. It's going to hurt the people of Florida. It's going to hurt revenues. It's going to hurt business. It's all bad. So nobody intends for this to happen. The only reason it happened is because DeSantis wants to run for president in 2024, and he needs to look tough against wokeness and liberals. And I mean, don't get me wrong. I think Disney should be severely punished, but not by the government and not over the Don't Say Gay bill. It should be punished by all of us who are Disney fans for taking away fast passes and putting in this stupid Genie Plus thing where they're charging you per ride. That's what they should be punished for.
You don't tell them, Skye.
That's right.
Yeah, because 2 Corinthians 4 says, I shall not pay per ride when I go to thine amusement park.
Not when I've already paid an admission ticket, no.
Yeah, that's right. And I read ultimately that it appears this is just a total act of political theater, because according to the Florida Constitution, if there is a special tax district passed by the legislature, the only way it can be overturned is by a vote of the citizens, the residents of that district. And who are the residents of Reedy Creek Improvement District? Walt Disney.
Right.
The
It's
company.
never going to happen.
The company is the resident.
This is Governor DeSantis just farting in the wind. There's nothing to it.
And this has been news of the bunch. But back to the rule itself, because some people are going to say, Skye, Kaitlyn, Phil, are you not against parents having control of what their kids are learning? It's an evil, evil world, and we need this rule. Okay, our complaint was not that the rule gave parents more influence over what their kids were learning. Our complaint was the new law was profoundly vague. The pejoratively titled Don't Say Gay law. And for proof of that, a school teacher, and I wanted to make this point because I think we said at the time, this doesn't even say what kind of gender or sexuality instruction is banned. It just says any instruction about any gender or any. So a school teacher in Palm Beach, Florida, wrote a template letter, which they're hoping that other teachers can then distribute to send home with their kids after this law passes. Here's the letter. It's kind of fun. Dear Florida parent caretaker, the Florida House of Representatives has recently ruled that, quote, classroom instruction by school personnel or third parties on sexual orientation or gender identity may not occur in kindergarten through third grade or in a manner that is not age appropriate or developmentally appropriate for students. To be in accordance with this policy, I, the teacher, your children's teacher, will no longer be referring to your students with gendered pronouns. All students will be referred to as they or them. I will no longer use a gendered title such as Mr. or Mrs. or make any references to my husband or wife in the classroom. From now on, I will be using the non-gendered title MX. Furthermore, I will be removing all books or instruction which refer to a person being a mother, father, husband, or wife, as they are gender identities that also may allude to sexual orientation. Needless to say, all books which refer to a character as he or she will also be removed from the classroom. If you have any concerns about this policy, please feel free to contact your local congressperson.
Yeah, we talked about this the first time the bill came up, that the language was so vague that even separating a classroom into boys and girls would be considered instruction in gender identity or assumptions about gender identity, which would be outlawed by this bill.
But Skye, no conservative parent is going to sue about any of those things. They will only sue about the things that we care about, which would be, non-heteronormative displays.
Fine.
Who would possibly sue about this normal stuff just to cause trouble?
That's a great point. You're right.
I don't know. Lucian Greaves?
Exactly. There are people in Florida who don't hold to conservative views, who don't like this bill, who could easily sue a school district for having a boys' bathroom and a girls' bathroom, for example.
Yeah, for having a book that has a mommy and a daddy in it.
Right. It's again, that just like the Disney thing, this is pure political posturing. It was done just to try to stick it to the libs and to look tough against wokeness, which is insane.
Kaitlyn.
I was just going to say, I do think we have to give credit to the people who are doing this. There is something really difficult, and it's become increasingly difficult for us to realize that there really are not topics that we can completely section out of our public life together. And public schools are a really central place for recognizing that we can't really be, unless we are going to take our kids out of public schools, we are all enmeshed with people of very different values and perspectives and ways of thinking about the world and humans and what's ultimate and, the kind of supernatural and all of those things. We can't, as much as we want to believe that we can sort of section out what is appropriate public things and what are appropriate private things, we can't. Our lives involve questions of sexuality and gender. Our lives involve questions of what's ultimately good and if there is something supernatural. And I don't know what the right answer in every case is, but I do think at the very least, this bill highlights for us that we're all grappling with trying to figure out what it would mean to live well together with all of those competing things. And one proposal for that tends to be, let's just bracket out those things that are not supposed to be in the public. And this bill highlights that you can't do that. There's no way to really pull those things out of our public life together.
And if we can't figure out how to have our kids go to school together, then we can't have a country together.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we used to agree. We used to agree on our values. We used to be on the same page, the same Judeo-Christian page.
Yes and
All
no.
of us.
Yes
Every
and no.
last one of us, except the Catholics. We weren't quite sure about the Catholics. Were they? Could they be citizens? Could Catholics be citizens? Where's their loyalty? That's what we wondered. So, but we used to generally agree. I mean, there weren't a whole lot of people that were upset that there were Psalms readings in the grade school readers.
Well, I would say there was more agreement, but there was never uniformity. This has always been a diverse country.
Yeah.
There used to be more uniformity among people who made decisions about those things than there are now. But
yes. And we've talked about this ad nauseum, but most of these challenges are not insurmountable. They've just been accentuated and amplified by social media and algorithms and cable news, and it's turned us all against each other in a ridiculous way.
Yeah. Do you know who Kayla McEnany is?
McEnany?
Kayla McEnany. She is a conservative commentator, Fox personality. At one point was being the conservative voice on CNN during the Trump years, and then something happened. And
she was a press secretary for Trump.
And then she became Trump's press secretary. That was later. That was after her CNN gig. She became Trump's press secretary. Anyway, she was talking with Kirk Cameron. That's where we all go to really give our hard-hitting interviews. Kirk Cameron on the Trinity Broadcasting Network on his talk show Takeaways. And she had the solution for all of this. She said, Christians have got to be bold. The antidote to darkness is light. And the antidote to a really grim future is filling the world with a lot of Christian babies who could bring that light to the world. That's what's wrong with the world.
The fields are white unto harvest, but the babies are few.
Atheist babies.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Okay. I wanted to bring this up because there are several ways that you could interpret this, what she meant by this. This was in Salon.com. I think Salon.com probably made the worst possible interpretation of this, which is that it was racist. And what she really meant was white, European babies.
Yes, that is definitely a negative spin.
Skye.
But
you think she'd really be upset about Hispanic Christian babies?
No. Well, here's the problem. This is my question.
Okay.
The two groups in the United States who exhibit the most Christian beliefs and values are African Americans and Latino immigrants. Yeah. Now, by generation 2 and 3, Latino immigrants tend to assimilate to America, and then they look a lot religiously like the rest of us, which means increasingly secular. But first generation Latino immigrants and their children tend to be highly, highly Christian and religious and family oriented and all those kinds of things. And yet, I don't pretend to assume her politics or views on these things, but she did work for an administration that was doing everything it possibly could to keep Latino immigrants out of the country and even curtailing legal immigration from countries that were not white.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So it's like, if you really, really, really want America to be more Christian, then you should celebrate more Black babies and more Latino babies. Mm-hmm. But that's not I doubt that's what she would advocate for in a policy way.
No, doesn't it all beg the question first, what exactly is a Christian baby?
I mean, isn't it a baby born to Christians?
Yeah.
I assume
maybe
that's
baptized
what
baby.
Is the assumption that if you're born in a Christian home that you're just going to grow up to be a conservative Christian?
Yeah.
Statistically, that's not as likely as it used to be.
I don't think there is any such thing as a Christian baby.
Are you saying that babies are born into original sin and condemned to hell?
Oh dear. So here's our next story. Moving right along.
No.
I'm just, what the heck is a Christian baby?
Well, here's the other problem.
Christians need to have more babies. She could have said that.
Here's the other problem.
I think that's what she means.
Yeah. Okay, fine.
Okay, fine.
And I read the article. I know she comes from a Southern Baptist background.
Yes.
What's
that have to do with it, Skye? What are you saying about Southern Baptists?
Because Southern Baptists, to their credit, have a very long history of focus on evangelism and missions.
Okay.
Right? That's just core to who they are.
Yeah.
If God's plan for evangelizing the world was procreation, I think we would see that somewhere in the New Testament.
I was going Old Testament. Kaitlyn's got something to say.
I've been waiting
to say.
Go, Kaitlyn.
Okay. So there was a Gospel Coalition article a few years ago that caused a big storm for basically making the same argument, right? That the best thing that you can do is be as fertile as possible. And that's how you win. And it explicitly said that's how you win the culture war. And one of the things that was like infuriating to lots of people, I think there was a sexuality debate kind of lurking in the article. People were upset about that. People were upset about culture war, and understandably why we would even kind of take that as a positive term to use. I was upset because, like Skye said, we have this really like striking picture in the New Testament of a shift away from a focus on biological procreation to the creation of a new family of God that is not bound by biology or ethnicity or culture or kind of social relationships. One of the best descriptions of this is not only the multiple times that Jesus says, you know, someone will say, your brother's here, your mother's are here. And he said, no, who is my brother and my mother? Those who are following me. But my favorite is when in Luke, a woman says to Jesus, blessed is the woman who birthed and nursed you. This very stereotypical in that context, you know, way of praising a woman for kind of the main thing that she could provide, which is what this article and what the article that we're talking about is sort of saying, right? You know, get women to have more babies. That's really the most impactful thing that they can do. This woman praises Jesus with that language. And he says, blessed rather are those who hear the word of the Lord and obey. And I can't help but imagine, as someone who had women disciples following around with him, doing something very culturally, you know, countercultural, walking around with this traveling preacher, and maybe many of them were widows. They had the ability to leave without having a family attached to them. They were in a strange social position in which their culture valued motherhood and marriage above everything else. And they were following this traveling preacher around. And Jesus turns and says, blessed rather are those who hear the word of the Lord and obey. And I think that's a really significant message for us to think about. Yes, there's something to think about, you know, biological families are really important and the way we treat our families are important. And there's something still maintained in the New Testament when it comes to the goodness of procreation and marriage and families. And yet the primary basis there is the family of God that doesn't look the way that we expect families to look and is not bound by biological realities. And our focus on having children to kind of win the culture war is really kind of ignoring the really fundamental command given to us in the New Testament, which is to go and make disciples. And that's a lot harder than just having as many children that you can have and sort of having this delusional idea that they will end up being exactly like you imagine that they will be. They'll kind of reproduce your theology and your politics. It's a lot harder to say my next door neighbor who has very different politics than me, very different theology than me, or none at all, I have to build a relationship with them because that's the command that I was given in scripture. And that has to cross racial and cultural and social boundaries. And the fact that we kind of default to this other thing that seems on face easier, even though it's not, I think is just a way for us to get out of the command that we were given.
Ooh. Okay, Kaitlyn gave a brilliant answer from the Gospels. Can I now give a Pauline kind of proof for this as well?
You're feeling a little insecure that you didn't do it biblically?
Because this brings up one of my favorite topics that I get a lot of ridicule for, which is circumcision. I know this is going to sound strange.
Oh, no.
I did a whole devotional series on this. But in the Old Testament, the mark of circumcision was given to Abraham after the promise that he would have descendants and they would be as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand in the sea and all that sort of stuff. So it was all, and it's not a coincidence that it's a mark upon the part of the body that involves procreation, right?
Mm-hmm. And that only men have.
And that only men have. And that the way that Israel and the Jewish people...
It's important, Phil.
Okay.
The way that they spread their power was by growing numerically. And you see that throughout the Pentateuch and the Old Testament, stuff like that.
That's what we're trying to do here, Skye. That's what we're trying to do.
And that's the model she's arguing for, is it's an old covenant model of we are going to dominate the world through procreation, through the the children of the flesh, to use Paul's
fruitful
language
and
in
multiply.
Galatians.
Fruitful.
Right. And then you get to the New Testament, and Paul writes all the time about the irrelevance of circumcision. And I think it's in Galatians. He finally crescendos his argument with neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything, but faith working through love. And his argument there is that what makes you part of God's family now, God's covenant people, is not a mark on your flesh, it's faith that manifests itself in love, which also speaks to the way this family now grows. It doesn't grow anymore through physical procreation of more offspring. It grows through the people of God, deeply rooted in faith in him, manifesting love in the world. All people will know you are my disciples by your love. And the way that family grows and adds new children is faith and love. So if Kaylee McEnany, whatever her name is, if she really wants to, quote unquote, win the culture war, if she really wants to see Christians come to dominate the world and bring flourishing to it, then love your neighbor. Call Christians to deep faith and acts of love. That's how you spread the gospel.
Especially if they're babies. I'm going to start a babies Bible study just for babies, and we're going to go through the Romans road, and I'm going to make Christian babies.
And to your point, Phil, even if you do have lots of biological babies, you still have to love them. You still have to care for them. You still have to welcome them into the community of faith.
I had Christian babies.
Yeah.
Okay, I just need to add one thing. The reason that I pointed out the thing about circumcision with Skye is because not only is there this description in Paul, but then in Acts, when the Holy Spirit comes and indwells believers, there's this line from Joel of your sons and daughters will prophesy. It's this equalizing thing to say, not only was this just through biological, procreation, but also this was a sign of like kind of importance, but when it comes to gender, that is now gone. The mark of the covenant isn't just only seen in men anymore. The mark of the covenant, the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, is across men and women, across social differences. The description there is like really striking, and that's also why I think that hits at the heart of this culture war thing, is to say that the kind of description that you have of what the church is marked by some not great social divisions, by gender inequalities, by all of these things that you're wanting to perpetuate, when the real description of the gospel going out shatters those inequalities and those differences and allows us to build relationships across really deep cultural divides. Like you said, Skye, just loving your neighbor. That also includes thinking about gender hierarchies. It involves thinking about race. It involves thinking about ethnicity. All of those things kind of get caught up in this story of the new family of God constituted by all of these differences.
And yet it fits perfectly, because when I meet Christians who are culture warring kind of Christians, they also tend to be old covenant Christians. They are Christians who are deeply enmeshed in the old covenant of Israel rather than the new covenant in Christ. And it makes sense. There's a reason you see wars of conquest in the Old Testament and not in the New.
Maybe they just didn't get that far because there were only 12 of them and they each had one sword and it wasn't enough.
Right.
Okay. Kaitlyn, you're probably right. Skye, you're probably right. I was just so excited about my baby's Bible study.
I'm down with baby's Bible study.
Yeah. Okay.
Still down with that.
And I'm not against people having babies, just to be clear.
Those would be some fun YouTube videos of the baby's Bible study, kind of like the Puppy Bowl. It's just a bunch of babies, and they're propped up in folding chairs, and they have they have coffee and they have little snacks.
You know what?
I want that.
They have enough immature Bible study open on their laps.
We have enough immature Christians teaching the Bible.
They're not teaching the Bible study.
They're not leading it. They're not ready to lead, Skye. Give him a couple months. Okay.
Yeah.
Last thing I wanted to touch on, our friend Jemar Tisby, he got singled out. He got taken to the woodshed by Grove City College and the trustees, who issued a report because he spoke at chapel at Grove City College in 2020, talked about racial justice. Everything was fine. The students clapped. He thought he did a good job. He thought everything was fine. And then 6 months later or so, a petition was circulated at Grove City College. The Grove City College is becoming woke and being infected by CRT, and 500 people, students and parents and alumni, signed it. And so they launched an investigation. The trustees board, for the first time that any of them could remember, had to launch an investigation to see, has our college been infected by critical race theory? And they maintained in the report just came out last week, that no, we have not changed. We have not changed. But we did make a mistake when we invited Jemar Tisby to speak at chapel, because, and this is curious, because they actually invited him in 2019, but then because of COVID, he couldn't come until 2020, because they said the Jemar Tisby we invited is not the Jemar Tisby that came to chapel. He changed. He became radical. He later, of course, this is after that, later went to work at Boston College for Boston University, Boston College for Ibram Kendi, but he's no longer there. And he also wrote a book, and this was, I think, the most damning evidence against Jemar Tisby. He wrote a book after speaking there at Chapel that promoted some things like voter policies, immigration policies, and race policies that are considered progressive.
Right.
Horrifying.
So I went back. I decided, okay, I'm going to do research because I'm a researcher. I can go to Duke Divinity School too if I want to. So I went back and actually watched his entire chapel talk. And he never mentioned anything that's associated with critical race theory in the whole talk. He never said white privilege. He never said any of the hot buttons that comes from critical race theory. There was no even critical race theory adjacent language in his chapel talk.
Phil, you are so naive.
What, Skye?
Don't you know that whenever anyone says anything about race that I don't like, it's now critical race theory? Or if anyone says anything about race that expects anything of me and my group, it is now critical race theory. And critical race theory is a false gospel.
It's critical race theory, I think.
What's that?
Even to say that we have groups, even if I say I'm Swedish, I think that's critical race theory. And it's against the gospel.
Right.
There are no Swedes in the New Jerusalem.
What's more disturbing about the fact that there was a petition put together of whatever it was, alumni and parents who were worried about critical race theory at Grove City College because of Jemar Tisby and other stuff. What's more concerning is then City Grove College put together some kind of special commission to investigate these concerns.
Yeah.
And they issued a report, and it would, I think, a shiver spread through the whole community at Grove City College looking for a spine to run up, because it was clear that there were no spines to be found anywhere because they completely folded and capitulated to the hysteria and nonsense.
That was a good one. I like that. I like that one.
Thank you.
Good. They said specifically about Jemar, last school year, GCC hosted a chapel presentation by Jemar Tisby, an outspoken apologist for CRT.
Which he isn't.
You know how many debates Jemar Tisby has engaged in where he defended critical race theory as an apologist for critical race theory? 0. He's never been in a debate defending critical race because he's not a CRT guy. He's a historian. So,
can we make up our own boogeyman, like our own 3-word acronym that we can use as a catch-all for everything that we don't like, that we're scared of and paranoid about?
Evangelical.
Christian Baby Bible Study. Evangelical, yeah.
I'm going to come up with one.
Some people would say that's what some people are doing with Christian nationalism, making it a boogeyman that covers everything.
No.
Skye? Oh, you say that's not true because that's your boogeyman.
No, because there are things that I think are problematic. Like, we just had this whole conversation about Disney and DeSantis and Republican Party. We didn't bring up Christian nationalism once to describe what they were doing, because it's not Christian nationalism.
True. It's critical race theory. It's baby Bible study. I don't know what to call it. I don't know. Kaitlyn, help out. Is your neck okay? You're doing a lot
I'm just done. I'm done.
Really using your neck a lot.
It is just like, how many ways can we avoid actually having a conversation about our differences? That's what I feel like a lot of this comes down to. Is like, we could have a good conversation about Christian nationalism appropriately defined by scholars who have studied it, but we don't want to do that. We could have a real conversation about critical race theory appropriately defined by scholars who understand it, but we don't want to do that. We want to just entrench our own sides and fight with each other and kind of avoid having a really good conversation where we take seriously people's concerns. We treat them as if they're, humans with legitimate fears and desires and hopes and dreams, and have a good conversation. Social media exacerbates that. Like Skye said, cable news exacerbates that. But I also just think there's something in humans that want to kind of avoid having a good conversation that, as you said, might cause us to change our mind, might mean that we have to risk something or even sacrifice something. We don't want to have those conversations. So we pick boogeyman words to fight around the real issue.
Yeah. And what concerns me more and more when when someone says, oh, you're promoting wokeness or you're promoting CRT, and I say, how, where, what, why, or you're being unbiblical. Quite often when you push all the way down to brass tacks, what they'll say is, well, aren't you positive about reparations? Or don't you think that the government should do more to help people? And then you realize, well, that's not about theology. That's about conservative politics. It's about small government. It's about not wanting handouts. So quite often, I think I'm trying to be biblical, and then what I'm actually being, lambasted for is not being conservative enough. It's not about not being biblical enough. Yeah. And I'm getting kind of tired. And that really comes across here when they say about they criticize Jemar's second book, which hadn't even come out yet when he spoke. Said he published How to Fight Racism, a book advocating, among other things, progressive policies relating to voting, immigration, criminal justice reform, government funding, political activism, forms of racial separatism, reparations, and other measures portrayed as furthering, quote, scare quotes, racial equity, unscare quote.
That was quotation marks? Or
yes.
Racial equity?
Yeah.
Man, we've lost the plot, guys.
That's like when you go to McDonald's and you see the banner about their chicken nuggets and they put white meat in quotes.
They don't do that.
Yeah, I saw that once.
You did?
I saw that once.
Don't be mean to McDonald's. I had a quarter pounder today for lunch. It was very nice and made of part beef. Okay. Kaitlyn, what do you have coming up? What? Oh, you're writing a paper. You got to turn it in on Wednesday and then you're all done, right? Or you turn it in tomorrow? Tomorrow?
I'm turning it in tonight.
You're turning it in tonight and then you're all done.
I'm all done.
And then you're coming up here to Wheaton for the summer to hang out with us, right?
No.
Oh, you going to home to Colorado? Where are you going? Are you just staying there?
I'm going to go to Italy for a month to study medieval art and spirituality. Somehow in the midst of all that, I'm writing a book.
And somehow in the midst of that trip, you're going to be on this podcast.
Also that.
And you're going to help me.
We got to figure that out.
You're going to help me launch our baby's Bible study.
Oh, I thought you were going to say build your wall. I would much rather help with the baby Bible study.
Yeah. No, I got the wall covered. I'm building the wall. It's a big, beautiful wall. It is great. Okay. Thank y'all for coming along. Thank you so much for your support on Patreon. We really appreciate it. It pays the bills, keeps the lights on, helps us find new books to read and new interesting people to interview. And there's a great guest coming up. Oh, this is a Kaitlyn interview today. It's a Kaitlyn interview today.
It is a Kaitlyn interview.
Hang around for the Kaitlyn interview. It'll be different than ours, than Skye's, yes?
And stay tuned this Friday for this month's French Friday is on with David French. We talk more about kind of the origins of the CRT hysteria, as well as a really interesting Supreme Court case about whether or not coaches can pray at public high schools with their athletes.
Yeah, that's a fun one. Mm-hmm. Okay, and we will see you next week. Bye, guys. The Holy Post is brought to you by our listeners who support us on Patreon. This episode is also sponsored by our friends at Faithful Counseling. Hey, are you under much stress? Do you ever post things on Twitter or Facebook that you later regret? Am I projecting? We all face stress and anxiety, and sometimes it's really nice to talk to someone who can actually help. Faithful Counseling is a Christian counseling service with more than 3,000 licensed therapists across all 50 states. And you don't have to go into an office. You can schedule secure video or phone sessions or even chat and text with your therapist. With expertise in depression, stress, anxiety, trauma, family conflicts, and more. Not happy with your counselor? Ask for a new one at any time. Financial aid is available for those who qualify. Plus, Holy Post listeners get 10% off your first month from our sponsor, Faithful Counseling. What have you got to lose? Give it a try. Go to faithfulcounseling.com/holypost. Just fill out a questionnaire to help them assess your needs, and you'll get matched with a counselor you'll love. That's faithfulcounseling.com/holypost. And now, back to the show.
A few years ago, the New York Times published an article exploring why Americans are having fewer and fewer children. It also featured survey results that showed the top reasons were almost all financial. People are worried about the economy, the expense of having children, the expense of childcare, and not having paid time off from work, meaning if they were to have a child, they would probably lose their job. All of that is why paid family leave has become such an important topic for those who are pro-family and pro-life. Amazingly, the United States is the only industrialized country that does not have guaranteed paid family leave. And economic insecurity is the leading reason women with unplanned pregnancies seek abortions. Our guest today is Rachel Anderson from the Center for Public Justice, a Christian organization that advocates for policies in Washington and around the country that conform to Christian theology and ethics. She's been working with a group of Christian leaders, including our own Kaitlyn Skye, on this topic of paid family leave. And she joins Kaitlyn for a conversation about why this topic is so important, why her own experience as a mother and cancer patient has made it even more important, and why more conservative Christians are not on board with paid family leave, despite all the evidence that it would be pro-family and pro-life. Over the years, we've talked a lot about the issue of abortion on this podcast and the way it's used in Christian communities to divide us or to create political expediency. We've also talked about the need for a holistic vision of human flourishing and life from the womb to the tomb. And this conversation between Kaitlyn Skye and Rachel Anderson is a great step to move you in that direction. It will help you think more broadly about what it really looks like to be pro-family and pro-life, and how we can advocate for policies that transcend our political divisions in order to bring a vision of flourishing and life to our very diverse, pluralistic society. Okay, here's the conversation with Kaitlyn Skye and Rachel Anderson.
Hi, Rachel. Thanks so much for spending time with us today.
Good to see you.
Yeah. People who regularly listen to the podcast will probably remember it was a few weeks ago, maybe a couple months ago, that I mentioned that I'd been doing some work with the Center for Public Justice on paid family leave policy. And I've been wanting ever since then to get you on the podcast to talk about a bunch of themes that I think are really relevant to people who listen to the Holy Post regularly, things like being holistically pro-life and what that means in terms of policies outside of just advocating for pro-life candidates or waiting for Supreme Court decisions, but thinking more holistically about other policies that can support families and parents. And then also people who are interested in thinking about what it means to seek the flourishing of our communities politically with the resources that are available to us in ways that might be more fruitful and more faithful than examples that we've seen in our past. So I'm just so excited, having spent some time with you and hearing your heart for all of this and your great knowledge for it, that you're spending time with us today. So could you just introduce yourself a little bit and explain maybe how you've gotten involved in the work that you're doing with the Center for Public Justice, and maybe for people who are unfamiliar, what the Center for Public Justice is?
Absolutely. Well, I'm a resident fellow at the Center for Public Justice, and CPJ is a Christian civic engagement and public policy organization. It's been around for about 45 years. It's ecumenical and rooted in a Christian political theology that recognizes government as a gift of God, and our role as Christians as being tasked with stewarding good government, good policies, and laws that kind of steward this creation. So I've been in public policy and advocacy for almost 20 years now, in a whole variety of roles. And often, as a Christian, seeking that point of loving those who are vulnerable, understanding that Jesus is present in those who are most vulnerable, that our call as citizens is to work for justice, and that we always have to come into the public square with integrity. That's not easy to do, but I find it a fascinating question and area of work.
Yeah, thanks. So we asked you today to talk partially because I just love what CPJ is doing, and I want to introduce people to CPJ and to you, but also because one of the conversations that we have a lot on the Holy Post, like I said, is about what it means to be holistically pro-life and to think of those broader policies. And CPJ has been working on this common ground proposal for paid family mothers, for paid family leave. Can you just talk a little bit about what that is, kind of give us an introduction to paid family leave policy and why it might be important for Christians to think about it?
Sure. So we at CPJ have been working on paid family leave for several years now, and calling for, very broadly, the need for a system of paid family leave for one that honors both work and the work of parenting and family. It's a complex issue. And so we have really wanted to consult an array of Christians, people who are wise and thoughtful. And so over this past year, we brought together a leadership council that you've been part of, thankfully, to kind of dig into the history, the different ways of offering paid leave. I think whenever anybody thinks of paid leave, you might think of your own experience or a few others, but we all have some different conceptions in mind. So we wanted to think together about what would be a good common ground approach.
Yeah. And what does it, I think when people think paid family leave, they might, like you said, have their own experiences in mind. But there's a diversity of needs that people might be trying to meet, whether it's their own medical care or caring for their families in different ways. Could you talk about your own personal experience with, maybe thinking about childcare or thinking about your own medical journey, or just give us some examples of like what needs might be met by a policy like this?
Yes. And really my journey of thinking about this occurred when I was in my 30s and I became a parent. The first thing that I realized was both my husband and I had started new jobs in that time, in our 30s. And we realized that at that time, the way kind of laws and health insurance worked, we weren't assured of having the pregnancy and childbirth covered by medical insurance unless we met a waiting period. Same with maternity leave and protected, being able to keep a job after spending time with our new son. It did all work out in our case, but it really struck me how odd it was to have this fundamental life event feel so precarious and so unprotected. And then, of course, as I became a mother and have loved the experience, but know it's a tremendous responsibility. I think about all the ways and the fact that for many families, the chips roll the other way, that the timing doesn't work out, that paid leave is not available, that health insurance doesn't line up in a way that they really need. And it seemed so discordant with the kind of family values that I was raised with, the values that I know many Americans hold. So that was one genesis of my interest in kind of what led me and CPJ to start this project. And then in this past year during the pandemic, I was diagnosed with cancer and I've been going through treatment. Thankfully, it's in remission, but it really is kind of an illustration of what we were seeking to honor in Families Valued, the fact that all of us can be vulnerable at times in our lives and in need of care. And absolutely, if I had not had access to even just time off from work to get diagnosed, I'm not sure I would have been diagnosed in a timely way. I mean, it's like, so I think about that a lot right now.
Yeah. One of the things I really appreciated being involved in the Leadership Council was the number of, because it was such a diverse group of people, the number of experiences that I got to learn about. I mean, I remember telling you early in the process, I was so honored to be asked to be involved as a single person who I think people might assume just doesn't have needs like that or doesn't have people in my life that I might need to care for, but that is really, that's not true. There are circumstances where single people have, ailing parents or, are just involved in the lives of people in their community such that they need access to medical care or to care for other people that are vulnerable in their community. And then getting to learn as someone who does live, a life, I live alone, I'm single, I don't have some of those more immediate claims upon my time, but being in part of a community of people who had young children on the Zoom call while we were talking about,
Yes.
policy, or who were dealing with medical needs that were very front and center in their lives in that moment. It's an experience that I wish we took more care to recognize in the church, that we were more intimately involved in people's lives and saw those needs and saw the way that policy could be involved in addressing them. And we've talked a lot in the group about a lot of the common responses that people will have to paid family leave policy, especially as Christians, especially in maybe evangelical communities in the US, that maybe they just have this general sense that their communities, their families, their churches should take care of people, should care for children, should care for the ailing without the government stepping in. And that can be one of the barriers to advocating for a policy like this. Can you talk about why federal policy on paid family leave and medical leave is important, even for people who think it really should be the job of the church or their local communities?
Mm-hmm. There's at least two reasons why it's helpful to think about this in a policy frame. One is that there's a clear need that and a scope of need that is more than I think families and communities can accomplish on their own and have not been able to accomplish on their own. So we know, for example, that only 23% of the workforce has access to paid family leave. Some households can kind of pull together other types of resources like their own savings or paid sick days, but it's still kind of cobbling it together for a lot of us. And then for a good 20% of the workforce, there really is no access to paid time off at all. And that's led to a situation where about 1 in 5 mothers gives birth, has to go back to work within a few weeks of having a baby. So that's, tons and tons of families. So the scope of need is pretty significant. And it leads to problems like the higher rate of child mortality and maternal mortality we have in the US as compared to peer nations. It kind of leads to some of the other challenges down the road that churches and communities are trying to help with. But I think it's a larger problem than what private aid can accomplish. And the market hasn't been able to accomplish it on its own either. And I think that's the second reason. Employers, just by way of history in the US, have been tasked with offering all these different benefits from health insurance to paid leave, but it's a real challenge. So small employers have a hard time offering something like paid leave. People who are self-employed have no access. And even some economists have pointed out that just the structure of something like paid family leave is such that for some employers, were they to offer it, it'd really be at a disadvantage competitively with others in the market. And so that's why we thought as a group, this is actually something where government should provide a baseline, right? Family is foundational. It shouldn't be kind of at the whim of who can pay for it or not. And by supporting family at that kind of foundational level, there are a great deal of benefits for the society overall, but they occur over generations, right? And they occur over, they inure to the whole society. So it really is a place where government can enable that benefit to happen.
Yeah, thanks. And I one of the things I appreciated in the proposal that CPJ, this group, kind of worked on together was having a sense of giving a theological basis for not only, why families matter and why caring for vulnerable people matters, but for why, as you've described, this might be one of the instances, at least, in which it is an important role for the government to be involved in, that there is something, we're not just kind of passing the buck to someone else, that we have a theological reason for thinking that this should kind of take a broader form. Can you talk a little bit about what theological or biblical resources we have for thinking about paid family leave policy in both of those kinds of ways, for thinking about caring for the vulnerable, but also for thinking about it in terms of what government can do to kind of serve those vulnerable people?
Yes. So one, of course, is all the ways that Scripture calls us to value family, from the beginning of creation to honoring one's mother and father to the wedding at Cana, which I always love because it has all these layers of Jesus and his mother's relationship and then the community relationship. And that very first miracle kind of extends from the family outward into sustaining a whole kind of community celebration. I think it's a great way to think about what God wants families to be and do. So of course, family is crucial. And as we've kind of discussed already, vulnerable families really can face some real stresses in having the resources they need to be able to care for family. And then when we think about the role of government, this is somewhat a distinctive that Center for Public Justice offers it kind of to the wider world of ideas. But we think about how God has created these different kinds of institutions, each for good and each for good purposes. And those include family, they include the workplace, they include the academy, the arts, all of those things. And the role of government is to enable those to work well together, to make it such that one doesn't overtake the other. So when we're in a world where parents are feeling forced back to work when they really need to be present with family, that's a just role for government to protect family and to make sure there's ample space in our society for the good of family.
Yeah, I love that. I think this is just such a good example for us to think about those kinds of broader questions. As someone who really cares about our political theology, to think, well, if we say that we really care about family, does that extend to policies that have impacts on families that are different from ours, that might have different needs than our own, needs that we might not be aware of or capable to meet, personally or in our communities? And one of the things I loved about the conversation that we had in the group with CPJ was thinking about that word family in all kinds of different ways and how important it was to each of us in different ways. Like, I came in concerned about this both theologically and personally as someone who, like I said, is single and doesn't have kids, but is involved really deeply in my local church and feels responsibility for the children that belong to that community and for the parents and their needs. And there were all sorts of different examples that people in that group gave of people that might not be considered family by certain definitions, but that we felt care for and obligation towards. Can you talk a little bit about how that word is used politically and how we might want to redefine or change it? It struck me so many times throughout this process that oftentimes there seems to be conflict between the people who want to say we're pro-family and the people who were advocating for a policy like this. And I think some of it comes down to that question of how are we defining what family means and how are we defining it, especially as Christians?
Yes. And I think also, what's the purpose of family? Is it to be inward and to set up a boundary, or is it to extend outward? And I think in Jesus's ministry, as I mentioned, like the wedding at Cana, we see the purpose is hospitality, not insularity for family. And yes, there are so many instances in the Bible where, again, family isn't just kind of blood relationship or the nuclear family. I think about how Jesus at the cross gave his disciple John and his mother Mary sort of to each other to be kin and to take care of one another in the next walk of their life. So families come together in that way so often. There are the ways that we're adopted into the community of Christ, and then as kind of brothers and sisters in Christ. So that opens up our sense of family. And then in the group, we talked a lot about how family is influenced by our family history and our culture. I come from a family that has always lived multi-generationally. So grandparents are always part of family in my household. And for some, it's aunts and uncles. For some, it's close family friends who rotate through caregiving roles. In some instances, it's close friends and people in our church communities. So we have to have a policy that makes room for that, makes room for taking somebody from your church to chemotherapy or enabling Ruth to take care of her mother-in-law.
I love the way that CPJ's work has highlighted both of those elements, the policy and the theology that underlies it. One of the things that the proposal talks about is that the U.S. is one of the few industrialized nations that doesn't have a federal paid family leave policy. Can you talk a little bit about why that's been so difficult in the U.S.? And maybe if you have any thoughts too on just why that's been difficult when it seems like, as I said before, there should be this like constituency of pro-family, maybe even specifically evangelicals that talk about being pro-family that haven't kind of had the political will or power to get something like that passed.
Yes. Well, I think we should be. I think we should be seeking that. It's a complicated history. I think there's a couple pieces. First, I should say there have been precedents in the U.S. In the early 20th century, there were largely women who advocated for mothers' pensions that would enable mothers who'd been widowed or whose husbands were unable to work to be able to care for their children without needing to give up their children for adoption or need to leave their children alone. And so there has been this idea in our public infrastructure that family caregiving matters and that's valuable. That program got kind of merged into some of the New Deal programs. So it kind of lost that particular thread. But then again, in the 1940s, as women entered the workforce and had been in the workforce for some time during the war, and in industries like garment making and food processing, and in the case of my grandmother, like administrative work. Unions that represented those female-dominated trades began to seek maternity leave as part of their contracts. And that was kind of the first time that became a possibility in the US. But again, the political movement to make that more universal stalled. And then in the 60s came the kind of the war on poverty. And I think that's where some of the paradoxes that still bedevil us emerged. So with the war on poverty, the kinds of family benefits that I mentioned at the beginning, they got associated with these questions of who's the deserving and undeserving poor. And to be deserving, one would need to work. But at the same time, there was a response to maybe the sexual revolution and a sense of women's liberation that led folks to say, we shouldn't be having women working, right? So suddenly policies needed to meet two criteria, that they needed to not disincentivize, not incentivize women to work, but at the same time, to deserve a benefit, you needed to work. So somehow we were supposed to work and not work at the same time. And I think we've really kind of been stuck in that place for some time, not being able to figure out what we're trying to achieve with these policies. One thing that we said as a group as we looked at it is that we felt like parental leave should be available to all parents regardless. It really is based on having a child. So if you're a stay-at-home parent, it's available to you. If you're a working parent, it's available. And the goal is to just enable and honor that caregiving at that point in life.
Yeah, thanks. One thing that I really love about how you in particular, but also CPJ in general, have gone about this process and other processes, but I've gotten to see it up close with this one with you, is how you brought a group of people with very different backgrounds and expertise together. The group was diverse in lots of ways in terms of family relationships, in terms of racial and ethnic background, in terms of expertise, in terms of theology, Catholics and Protestants of different denominations, and just a really mixed group of people. And you were really deeply committed to building consensus and finding common ground, and not sort of just, my impulse as someone who's like very action oriented would just be like, okay, I'm sure we can agree on these 5 things. Let's just go with that, instead of taking a lot of time like you did to bring out the theology and our experiences and find common ground and really get into details of policy and see what it would look like to get a group of people to agree on a statement, and also to have that statement help bring consensus among Christians of various backgrounds, theologically, racially, et cetera. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like and means for you, and why building consensus in that kind of way is valuable, and maybe what that could even teach us? I know a lot of people listening are wondering what that means in all sorts of contexts in their life, whether they're working on things in their churches or in their work, or even just in their family. They're trying to have hard conversations and looking for what it looks like to, as it says in the title of the proposal, common ground, and how they could seek that.
Yes. Well, something that I believe and that is core to Center for Public Justice is this understanding of citizenship as, by definition, a collective activity. So God called humanity to steward creation together. So that means to govern and hold power together. So, and we are different, by definition, we are different and diverse. So, it means that we have to, build this practice of holding power together, seeking common ground with people who are different than ourselves. I really think that is the sacred task of citizenship and politics. It does have particular meaning to me right now because we are so surrounded by an environment that pulls us into something quite different, right? That pulls us to be seeking attention for ourselves, often by like lambasting or ridiculing people who are other than us. We're called kind of in a polarized environment, or we're pushed in a polarized environment to kind of flatten out those who are different from us and just see them as very one-dimensional. Whereas there's, grace and a sense of universal human dignity calls us to understand those differences and see the nuances. So I think it's a really important practice to do right now. I do think it is a practice. It's like collaboration is learned. It's not easy to do. We did develop a resource called Political Discipleship for small groups to sort of practice this through a series of sessions on an issue that matters to them in their own community. So that's always available for folks. And I'm really hopeful that this is an issue, paid family leave, is an issue where Christians can work, side by side with Christians with whom they disagree, with others with whom they disagree, to provide this vital foundation that's so important for our whole society.
Yeah. I feel really thankful. I feel like I learned a lot from you and from the group in general about what it means. And we had a conversation not very long ago about even highlighting some of those differences in order to show that, we can have serious disagreements politically and theologically. We could, be Catholic and Protestant, or we could be even pro-life and pro-choice, and find a way to work together towards a policy that I might have distinct reasons for supporting it that are different from someone else, but I can find this area of common ground. Is so encouraging to think about that.
Sometimes it helps to name the differences, and then you can kind of open your hands and leave those differences to God, right? Instead of needing to either hide them or fear the conflict that might emerge. Yeah. It was wonderful to see the group work together, and I loved your contributions. It was just a fantastic experience.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, I really, it gave me, like you said, hope too, that there's like a way that we could, if we were thoughtful, and careful. Like it takes time. It's not something that you could do. Like I said, I want to rush towards like, let's find the 5 areas that I'm sure we all agree on and kind of push everyone there, instead of the slower work of hearing from people's stories and experiences is valuable, but it takes a lot of commitment to try and do that. Could you share with us just ways that people could either learn more about what CPJ is doing on paid family leave, or ways that they could get involved? Like I said, I think there are a lot of people listening who might be pro-life in some ways and really are trying to figure out what that means to be more holistically pro-life. And they've kind of heard like, hey, it might be great to have policies that support women and support families and parents, but might feel kind of powerless or maybe even unsure of where to learn about those kinds of things. Could you just talk to us about what kind of resources are out there, or what ways people could begin to get involved in some way?
Yes. The group that you are part of developed a statement about paid family leave, and it is not too policy wonky. I think it's pretty cool, but also gives us a concrete vision of what it could look like in the United States. So that's available on our website, familiesvalued.org. And also there are some opportunities to participate in webinars and trainings if you're interested in advocating for that. And so we can walk alongside folks in building a kind of a team of neighbors and friends who are interested in advocating, and help folks advocate at a level that you feel comfortable, right? Like, what's my story, and then what can I offer to this conversation? Not feeling like it has to be, down to every like dotted I and crossed T. All kinds of voices are really valuable. So there's opportunity to sign up for those types of webinars also at familiesvalued.org. And then also take a look at our political discipleship resources. I'm hopeful that there are small groups that can find just some support for just that slow, deliberative work of citizenship. But it's very beautiful as well, because we learn so much from one another when we take time to listen and work intentionally. So that's also available through CPJ.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I have learned so much from you and so much from this group. And just thank you for sharing with us not only kind of like this theological background for all of these questions that I think is so good and important, but as someone who has experience in, like you said, the wonky details, thank you for just sharing with us your expertise and your knowledge and your heart, which I've seen, over the last year, of just desire for Christians to think well about how to care for families, especially the most vulnerable. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you, and thanks for this conversation.
The Holy Post podcast is a production of Holy Post Media. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/Holy Post. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele, and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much more.